So the left lens with Danny Haiphong. Why didn't Mao do an NAP program like Lenin did when he came to power? Good question. Very good question. You know, I think a major reason for this, so there are many reasons for this. One of which, so what's interesting is that after the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union was invaded by more than a half a dozen. I think it was something like 15 imperialist countries, the United States included, sent like 10,000 Marines into the Soviet Union to fight for the whites. There was a civil war. It was bloody. It was disastrous. This was right after World War One, mind you. So after that, I mean, the economic base was decimated, and the Soviet Union was already started out from a very disorganized place. It didn't really have a bourgeois capitalist economy, and it didn't really have a fully fledged feudal economy, either semi-feudal or colonial economy. It was kind of a mixture of all of those things. And Lenin made the decision to go with the NEP because, one, a war just had happened and there was just massive economic problems, massive just underdevelopment, and it was necessary, right, to do everything possible to enhance the productive forces. That's really what Lenin was going for, enhancing the productive forces immediately to build an economic base for socialism. And it was largely effective. And it didn't have to last that long, right? Because not too long into Stalin's tenure after Lenin died, there was massive industrialization and collectivization, which many see as a disaster, but the results were kind of bore fruit. The Soviet Union became an industrial powerhouse, and conditions for everyone improved mightily all the way up until World War II. It was one of the fastest growing economies. Technologically, it was starting to beat the West scientifically in many areas. And so China in 1949, though, I think there were a couple of problems here for China in 1949. One is that the feudal base, right? The feudal base in China, the semi-colonial base, was actually more entrenched. The Soviet Union had been decimated by war. But not only was China decimated by war, but it was coming from an even lower place of development. There's no doubt about that. There was no mixture of anything in China. There was no capitalism in China. China was incredibly poor. China did not have the capacity to institute an NEP. And then right after 1949, it was economically sanctioned from the world. So China had to really mobilize collectively immediately and relied upon political mobilization, communal mobilization to build up an industrial base instead, because it was largely isolated. Now, the Soviet Union also struggled, right? It struggled as well, but it had certain advantages, right? From its proximity to Europe, as well as how it had developed prior to the Russian Revolution. It had some advantages in that way. Even though it was destroyed, there was still a base, there was still some industry, there was some ability to rapidly develop the productive forces, while China had to start from a very, very agrarian situation. So the situation was a little different. It was not incredibly different. It was not in the extreme, but it was different. China was 100% nearly an agrarian society, while the Soviet Union had some productive forces to work with and had the capacity to mobilize a kind of capitalist development model for its benefit, at least in the short term. But China didn't have that opportunity until those sanctions were lifted. And so China relied a lot. It did rely a lot on Soviet Union's friendship all the way up until the split. There was a pretty robust cooperation between the two, beginning in the early 50s and then tapering off as we approached the 60s. There were starting to some conflicts, some differences, especially after Khrushchev's secret speech. There was political differences, and then of course the border disputes and all of that. There were differences between the two, but the economic relationship was strong, and China couldn't rely on anybody. It couldn't, and it didn't have a base to begin with. So I think that was the reason why Mao could not pursue an NEP, like a new economic policy like program in China right away. Now, it wasn't like, and this is important, because one of the things that a lot of Western leftists like to do is they like to act like there was some kind of major difference, right? Some kind of major difference between China and the Soviet Union, and that when China started reform and opening up, it was a betrayal of socialism. And that Mao would never have done that because Mao was following the pure socialist line, similar to the early Soviet Union before the NEP, before Lenin's death. That's kind of how things are perceived. And I just got to tell you that it's an incredibly damaging, false conclusion. It's propaganda because read Mao on New Democracy, read Mao's work, especially around the early period of the revolution. He explicitly says that China will have to incorporate capitalist elements into its economy if it is to succeed and become stable, if it is to build the conditions for socialism. Now, he didn't say, oh, we need to reform and open up. That wasn't possible. The imperialists were breathing down their neck, sanctioning them, trying to wage war in the Taiwan Straits. It wasn't a situation where China was like, oh, where Mao was like, oh, yeah, we got to reform and open up now because the opportunity is there. No, but certainly Mao was talking about, and the Communist Party of China was talking about all possible means to increase the productive forces and to ensure that socialism in China is prosperous, not just about socialization, but also a prosperous socialist system. So I think that's really important to note. And I think the big reason is that the conditions were different. And, I think one other reason, I'll just conclude here, the Soviet Union was the first, okay? So the Soviet Union didn't really have the ability to work with another socialist country like China did in the early period during the sanctions. The Soviet Union had to incorporate anything it could to get out of war-like economic conditions. And I think that's another reason. I think when Mao in the Communist Party of China came to power and they were presented with this semi-feudal, impoverished economic situation, there was still a lot of hope that communal organization, that collective organization could eradicate those things. And then the sanctions, of course, helped to affirm that. Well, surely the Soviet Union wanted a primarily state-owned economy. That's what it eventually became. And certainly it wanted the workers' councils and all of that to be what spearheaded development. But at the same time was ticking. A civil war was raging, and the imperialists were also down the back. So I think really we're talking about a matter of just different responses responding to both similar and much different conditions. And I think that in the end, both decisions were correct in the beginning, and then both socialist experiments also had to deal with the drawbacks, right? Had to deal with, well, the NEP did not succeed in figuring out the agrarian question in the Soviet Union, which is why there was collectivization. It's why the landlord class, the so-called kulaks, it's why they had to be dealt with, because they were holding back development. In China, collectivization, the communes did not solve the problem of extreme poverty. It solved the problem of the need for an industrial base and a socialist economic base to meet people's needs, but people were still very poor. There was basically essentially no industry, no modern industry until the late 80s, right? So that's why reform and opening up had to happen, because the revolution would have been in very rough shape without it. It would have been.